In this 32-year-old patient, tooth number 1-2 was removed several months ago following unsuccessful endodontic treatment. The X-ray measurement shows an obvious bone deficit in the vertical dimension. The gauge shows an 8 mm wide gap, an ideal situation for implantation of a StandardPlus implant with an endosteal diameter of 4.1 mm and a regular neck restorative platform of 4.8 mm. For the procedure, terminal anesthesia of the vestibular and palatal mucosa is administered as usual. Exposure of the alveolar process commences with an incision on the ridge, which is made slightly towards the palatal side. The incision is continued carefully in the vestibular direction in the sulcus of the adjacent teeth. The mucoperiosteal flap is raised with a fine periosteal elevator. The sulcus incision is then relieved vertically in the vestibular direction in the region of the adjacent teeth. The mucoperiosteal flap is then raised completely from the alveolar process. To obtain better visibility, this can then be held in situ with 2 retraction sutures. The probe shows an intact alveolar wall that is moderately atrophic only in the marginal region, while the crestal bone margin is situated about 1 mm below the enamel cementum border. The site plan for insertion of the implant is now smoothened and flattened using a large round burr at a maximum speed of 800 rpm, cooling it with a sterile saline and reducing the height of the bone only slightly. The implant position is then marked with round burrs of increasing diameter at a speed of up to 800 rpm with cooling. This facilitates subsequent positioning of the pilot and twist drills. To achieve implant placement that is exactly in accordance with the planned implant axis, we recommend using a drill template to carry out the initial drilling step. Thus prepared, the implant bed is created in its definitive axial alignment with the first length-coded pilot drill with a diameter of 2.2 mm using a maximum speed of 800 rpm. All drilling is carried out with slightly intermittent drill movements and cooling with sterile saline. The planned axis direction is checked with a 2.2 mm diameter alignment pin. Besides the axis direction, the depth can also be verified. The orofacial implant position is now checked with a 2.2 mm diameter depth gauge with attached distance indicator ring. The periphery of the 4.8 mm ring should be placed against the adjacent teeth slightly palatal or lingual to the periodontal probe. The implant bed is now widened with the second pilot drill, which has a diameter of 2.8 mm at a maximum speed of 600 rpm until the planned depth of insertion is reached. The orofacial position and the depth of drilling are again checked with the depth gauge. The planned position is now optimal. Seen from above, adequate vestibular bone availability is also apparent. To make it easier to fix the next sized drill in the hole, the bone margin can be flattened slightly with a 2.8 mm diameter profile drill. The implant bed is widened with the 3.5 mm diameter twist drill at a maximum speed of 500 rpm. For increased visibility and convenience, the pilot and twist drills are coded with a 2 mm wide black band, the upper margin of which indicates a depth of 12 mm and the lower margin indicates a depth of 10 mm. This 2 mm wide black band helps facilitate the surgical procedure as 10 mm and 12 mm length implants are the most frequently placed implant lengths. The axis and the orofacial alignment permit the correct three-dimensional position of the implant. After the exact depth of drilling has been reached, the flared shape implant neck configuration is transferred to the bone with a 3.5 mm diameter profile drill at 400 RPM. At the same time, the vertical position of the implant is checked. The implant thread pattern is tapped in the bone with the 4.1 mm diameter tap. To do this, the looped end of the ratchet is placed over the handle of the tap and stabilized with the holding key. The arrow on the ratchet must point in the clockwise direction. When the desired depth is reached, the arrow on the ratchet is changed to counterclockwise and the tap is unscrewed from the implant bed. In this case, use of a StandardPlus implant with an endosteal diameter of 4.1 mm and a regular neck of 4.8 mm is planned. To remove the implant from its holder, the adapter for ratchet is connected to the transfer part and must audibly click into place. The ampoule is then pulled downwards with slight twisting movements and the implant is lifted out. While doing so, your hand should be supported on a firm surface. The implant is now transferred to the prepared implant bed without contaminating it with saliva, blood or instruments. The ratchet is then placed over the adapter and the arrow on the ratchet is changed to clockwise. The adapter and ratchet are stabilized with the holding key and the implant is screwed into its final position with slow turns. After the final position is reached, the holding key is removed and its forked end is put on the hexagon of the transfer part. To release the transfer part from the implant, the arrow on the ratchet must now be set to counterclockwise. The screw connection is released and the transfer part is removed. The final vertical position is reached when the implant shoulder is situated at the same height as the enamel cementum margin of the adjacent teeth. The implant should be surrounded by a layer of bone at least 1 mm in thickness. The small marginal recession is later augmented with autologous bone chips. In aesthetically important areas, the implant shoulder can also be placed 1 mm deeper than the enamel cementum border of the contralateral tooth. This position allows an optimal emergence profile of the future restoration. The inside of the implant is now coated with never-set-in ointment. For partially submerged healing, a beveled healing cap is screwed into the implant by hand using an SCS screwdriver. The marginal bone defect on the vestibular side is now augmented with autologous bone chips. Small chips can be taken directly from the immediate surroundings of the basal alveolar process with a sharp periosteal elevator. A membrane can be omitted, but the mucoperiosteal flap is relieved basally by a slit in the periosteum. This ensures tension-free wound approximation. The wound edges are approximated interdentally with atraumatic monofilament sutures. This is followed by closure of the vertical relieving incisions. The sutures are removed after about 7 days. The post-operative X-ray shows the correctly placed Straumann StandardPlus implant with the implant axis in good parallel alignment with the adjacent teeth.